Hey you guys, this is Tired Goth, and you are reading Malware with me. So, this episode is actually going to be covering defeating ransomware through vulnerability exploitation. That's the title of the paper that we're reading here. This was hosted and downloaded from none other than VX Underground. They are one of the largest repositories ever on the internet for any of your most basic but also intermediate research needs for malware development, malware software integration, malware samples themselves, malware papers, discussions, dissections, you name it, they have it. And they are definitely a culminated source of a lot of different sources on the internet. So they're an excellent place to start if you're just getting into this. Go check them out, buy some merch, support them. They're amazing. So let's get into this. This paper is by Malvuln, otherwise known as John Page, aka Hyperlinks. I know that feeling, having like three different names people can call me by at any given time. So, this is from malvuln.com. That's the official source of this paper, the official publication source of this paper. And his email address and apparitionsec@gmail.com is one of his referentials, one of their referentials. I'm not going to assume anything here. Let's see. So, the introduction states, the Malvuln project started January 1st, 2021, and currently catalogs approximately 666 vulnerable pieces of malware to date. Witnessing the endless ransomware attacks in the news, and as I had no ransom trophy skills, I figured I would take a crack at it. At first, ransomware seemed like a big challenge. I am not aware of any sample that listens on any ports that can be abused, and local elevation of privilege techniques mean nothing when things get encrypted immediately. Okay, so what he's talking about here is his personal experience cracking in on something that was brand new at the time, but has actually been attributed to other, I guess you could say, like data cults and international threat groups. I want to say like APT, what was it? Not 41, but like APT 39 or 29 or something like that. It's a Chinese ransomware group. So they're based in Asia, and the ransomware that they're responsible for is purposely like listening on ports and like siphoning information to secondary servers. And yeah, I want to say it's APT 29. This one that I'm referring to with a loose translation or transliteration to how these attacks happen, right? So this particular, and this is just off the top of my head. If you'd like to go back and research it, it's also cataloged on my blog at https://www.patreon.com/agofficial, right? So, uh, this particular, like, introduction of his is actually showing his own skill set, or their own skill set, in cracking malware, cracking into, the type of ransomware that would be like capturing your data and then locking it away so that you can't gain access to it. He goes on to say, but wait, in steps, DLL hijacking. So for those of you who don't know what DLLs are the configuration and action files for Windows. So if you're using a Windows-based machine, Windows is actually going to run a lot of DLLs to activate applications and programs so that you can use them at face value the way that they usually run. However, it's also a very common infection site for all of these applications because people figured out that if you can get into the DLL configurations and switch a whole bunch of stuff around, then you basically get your option to infect the software with whatever it is that you wrote in the way of a string, a code, whatever you're trying to inject there, and then activate it as if it's part of the program. That's how that ends up working. So they go on to say in this paper, in May 2022, I publicly disclosed a novel strategy that successfully defeated ransomware. Using a well-known attacker technique, otherwise known in this case as the DLL hijack, to terminate malware pre-encryption. Pre-encryption, as opposed to standard encryption types, will kind of isolate certain parts of data and then wrap them to be encrypted so that it prevents access from a decryption that would otherwise be unlocking it normally. Meaning that, like, if you have a password protection on something, that's your standard encryption. That's what you chose. That's what you made, right? But in the case of a pre-encryption, the pre-encryption drops an encryption into that input field and switches it and says, like, this privilege is now owned by this administrator, which is something that's overwritten into the system. It's not something naturally there. It's not something naturally configured. It's also not something that the person who owns the machine wrote in themselves. It's not something that they set up for themselves. It's actually something written in as part of the ransomware to override privileges and to grant more so direct privileges to someone who doesn't own the machine so that they become administrator, which is like the highest level of privilege that a person can have on the Windows machine in this case. So once a person who is not the owner is running as an administrator and able to infect these parts of the machine gets pre-encrypted. Parts of it get locked away from its own rightful use by the person who owns the actual box, like theoretically the person who paid for it, whoever, right? This is part of the reason why ransomware has been such a threat, because it's one thing if it affects one machine, right? But it's a totally different thing if it starts affecting the whole entire network that the machine is connected to. So if you have like one person at an office gets ransomware on their machine, but the ransomware touches the entire network, it's a possibility that every single person who works for, with, or around that person is also getting their stuff locked out of, like getting them locked out of their own belongings, getting their stuff locked away to a separate holding, getting their stuff stolen, basically. It's not a joke, it's not funny, it's just that the way that it occurs very quickly and very effectively can be very jarring and startling for people, obviously, right? So we have that, but there's also this, like, it's basically what this guy does is he's going into the ransomware, like, encryption module and discussing how you can actually reverse it or even prevent it by like honing in and targeting where those attack sites within the framework of the DLL really are. So that way, if you were trying to reverse malware that is a ransomware, you could actually go there and like check to see that the integrity of the software is actually there. So he goes on to say, they go on to say, forgive me, the first malware to be successfully exploited was from the group Blockbit MVID-2022-0572. So that is actually like, that's what you would call like the CVE or the kind of identification number if it's not a CVE for the report that identified this particular reference material that other people have gone to in their research to then backtrack how they can best apply it in their own research purposes for malware defense, malware cracking. So, followed by Conti, R Evil, Black Basta, and CryptoLocker, proving many are vulnerable. So, what he's saying here is that these groups, Conti, R Evil, Black Basta, CryptoLocker, these are the ransomware imperfect systems. These are the people who enacted these types of malware. These are the groups referenced there. These are the malware ransomwares themselves. These are a number of collections of data that proves that even though they have a very powerful encryption module and method to attack machines, it's not perfect yet. It hasn't been honed to the point where it's infallible, meaning that this guy is able to now decrypt what it is that they locked away and return possibly assets that were stolen to the people who they got stolen from. To return them to who got them stolen. That's what I meant to say. There you go. So, DLL hijacking is a method of injecting malicious code into an application by exploiting the way that Microsoft Windows applications search and load dynamic link libraries, otherwise known as the DLLs we're referencing. So the dynamic link libraries, in an executable sense, for and just to break it down, Windows programs are called executables, not because they're, at the, the execution station, but because they are activating information and then running it. The execution is when the program runs in this context. So we're not talking about somebody with a mask on their head holding an axe or a guillotine rope. We're not doing any of that. We're talking about the actual activation of these programs so that when they start running, they run a certain way. Um, so the attack site is actually at the onset of these programs running the way that they do, because if there is a preset set of data, meaning it runs before the application can fully load and connect to each piece of the library that's feeding it the information that it uses to run. For example, there could be a dynamic link to a C library